All right, good morning, everyone. I think we're going to get started in 1 second. Thank you all for joining us. My name is Sarah Copper, and I'm a research manager at JPAL Global based at MIT. As many of you know, at JPAL, the safety of field staff and respondents is of utmost priority, and we've been quickly putting together resources to help research projects transition from in-person to phone surveys. We've posted a set of practices on phone surveys, which you can find on the response section of our website. We're also recording this webinar, and we will post the recording on that page shortly. Today, we're pleased to have Tavneet Suri from MIT Sloan, Mansa Saxena, and Leslie talk about insights behind surveys for the Universal Basic Income Project in Kenya to be done via phone. Tavneet is an associate professor of applied economics at the MIT Sloan School of Management. She's an NBR faculty research fellow, a junior affiliate at the Bureau for Research and Economic Analysis of Development, a research affiliate at JPAL, a research affiliate at the Center for Economic Policy Research, and the co-director of the Agriculture Research Program at the International Growth Center. Her research centers on applied microeconomic issues in sub-Saharan Africa with a focus on technology adoption, risk sharing, and consumption smoothing, the role of measurement error in poverty dynamics, and the role of infrastructure in the development of markets. Her research currently spans Kenya, Ghana, Rwanda, and Sierra Leone. Tessie Lizcano is a research manager at IPA in Kenya, where she manages a portfolio of impact evaluations in digital finance, SME growth, social protection, women's empowerment. She organizes and oversees online data collection activities for the UBI project. And Mansa Saxena is Tavneet's RA based in Cambridge. She's responsible for setting up and managing the data monitoring systems for the surveys being implemented in Kenya for UBI's first N-line. So Tavneet, Tessie, and Mansa will begin with the presentation, then be available for Q&A. Please use the Q&A feature in Zoom to submit your question, and we will monitor that closely. We won't be on the chat. I'll hand it over to Tavneet now. Tavneet, you're still muted.
Hi, everyone. Tavneet. Let's try that again. Does that work? Great. Sorry about that. I am certainly learning how to use Zoom very slowly. So thank you all for being here. I know it's a bit of a crazy time in the world, and I'm really grateful to all the JPAL IPA staff and all our partners who've been helping us kind of both put this together as well as transition our work in a way that sort of maintains bits and pieces of it. I also want to thank my team. Tessie, Mansa, and Shreya are on the call and will jump in when they need to and help answer questions, especially about specifics, either on the back end of data management in the US or on field management. And so I'm really grateful to them. I'm also grateful to the rest of our team in Kenya, and I'll sort of give you the long list of people who've kind of been helping us make these transitions as we work through this. So let me start off by talking through a bit about kind of general guidelines for using phone surveys. We've done phone surveys on our Universal Basic Income Project. If you hear me say UBI, that's the Basic Income Project. So I'll start off by just going through kind of what we've learned about phone surveys and how we do them. And then I'll try and spend a bunch of time talking about how we adapt to doing phone surveys during COVID. So in general, you need verbal consent, which means you might have IRB implications. Some places and some universities are trying to speed up that IRB for this purpose. The second thing is we always give incentives at the end of the survey in airtime or prepaid phone credit between $1.50 and $3, depending on the sample. It's supposed to account for opportunity cost of time as well as, people spending time on the phone and sort of wearing the phone down, spending charge, and then they might have to go pay to get it charged. We think of no more than a half hour to 40 minutes. That means the longest survey shouldn't be more than 30 to 40 minutes, not the average survey. So they have to be pretty short. And then the way we structure it, we make 9 attempts total per household. You can only do a max of 3 per day. They have to be 3 hours apart, and we leave 1 day in between trying. So we give a break to a household if we've tried them in a row for a day 3 times. Let me tell you what our team structure looks like in general for phone surveys. It, of course, depends on the sample size and the complexity of the survey. So we have our research manager, Tessie, who I mentioned earlier is here. She's my research manager in Kenya. They're not full-time. They work on maybe multiple projects. We have 1 RA research associate in the field. This could be optional depending on the size of your team and the size of the sample you're trying to call. We have 1 data research associate in the US. Time differences tend to help. So the way we structure things is the field team works during the day, uploads data that gets then checked in the US while the field team basically goes to bed, and they wake up in the morning to sort of a bunch of stuff from the US. We have 1 field manager, and then 1 senior field officer for every 4 to 5 field officers, enumerators, if you want to call them that. If we have a really great field manager and the survey's not huge, then we can kind of dispense with the research associate in the field. Kind of depends how many people you're trying to manage and how big the survey is. Okay, so here's some general tips for phone surveys. The first is to create tracking sheets with phone numbers and attempts. So detailed tracking sheets that track every person, their phone number, and the number of attempts. We also make and track appointments if the respondent is busy. We'll often call in, they'll say, oh, I'm really busy, and we'll try and make an appointment and then call them back at that appointment, offering also evenings and weekends. We do this on the tracking sheet and also in Survey CTO. There's a way to create appointments in Survey CTO. The other thing we usually require is after the 3rd attempt on a given day, you submit a survey into the system. So we know that you tried 3 times, we know the results, and that helps us with tracking. The second important piece is a strict protocol on what to do if the person who answers the phone is not the target respondent on the tracking sheet. So for example, if the tracking sheet says call Tavneet at this number, and you call it and instead Sarah answers the phone, well, you don't want to interview Sarah because you're supposed to be interviewing Tavneet. So you need a really strict protocol about what to do then. So we usually have a set of questions for the person who answers the phone. First, to figure out, do they even know the target person? If they do, try to get a phone number for the target person from them. If they don't know them, or if that fails, we try to reach someone else in the original household. So we go back to a baseline where we collected phone numbers for everybody in the household, hopefully, and then try calling someone else in the household to see if they know how to reach this person. You know, if you didn't collect all these numbers at baseline, now collect lots of numbers, and I'll talk about that a bit more in a second. The other thing we also like to have is a strict protocol of refusals. The refusals tend to be higher on a phone survey than in person, at least that's been our experience. And so whenever we have a refusal from an FO, we actually ask the SFO to follow up and talk to the respondent separately. And then it's useful to have clear productivity targets at the start of the survey. Say you want to finish X surveys per day, actively track each field officer that way. And then we have some additional HFCs, high frequency checks. So these are checks that you do every day on the data that's coming in. We monitor section-wise timestamps for the enumerators. These are produced by Survey CTO. We do a bunch of extra consistency checks. We link roster to the other parts of the survey and make sure things look consistent. And we do check timings of when the calls are made. I'm going to talk a bit more about that later as well. And then another useful tip is if you have several languages, you create a strict protocol on how to work with several languages. So you should know before you launch a phone survey, what do all the FOs speak, who speaks what, and the SFOs have to be ready to reassign the FO at the drop of a hat. You want to try and keep the respondent on the phone and find someone who can speak the language. And then we've also created a protocol for sensitive questions and participant wariness. Again, this is higher on phone surveys than in person. And so if there is some of that, the FO usually hands the phone to their SFO to explain both our confidentiality reasons, the project, why the project's important, why the research is important, and therefore why participation is important. Collect as many phone numbers as possible for the person. They might have multiple SIM cards. Ask about each SIM card. Ask about their spouse, their kids' phone numbers, their spouse's phone numbers. basically try to collect as many phone numbers as possible. And then we tend not to use text to inform people we will call. It's reasonably unsuccessful for us. I think there's a lot of stuff coming over text. And so we tend not to use this to warn people to call, that we will call. Okay, great. So those are kind of the big general tips for phone surveys. Let me talk a bit about shifting to phone surveys during COVID and how we do this. So now we're going to shift to phone surveys, and not just phone surveys, but all calls will be made from home by your FOs or your enumerators. So not only are we doing things, moving from in-person to phone, but you also have to realize that the FOs will be working from their homes. So you need different monitoring of the surveys, since the FOs or the enumerators are not in the office. So I can't, stop in the room and watch them and make sure they're all there. And then if you're switching from in-person to a phone survey halfway through or 3/4 of the way through, the instrument needs to be shortened dramatically. So I'm going to talk about both of these things separately and kind of what we've done. So the additional monitoring, this is what we're doing for our switch. Oh, let me say one thing before I do that, sorry. Let me talk a bit about the Universal Basic Income Project. This is a huge RCT running in 2 counties in Kenya. We have a sample size of about 9,000 households, and we have a sample of about 1,500 people who've migrated out since. The baseline was about 2.5 years ago. The end line, we did an in-person end line that ended in December. And then what we've been doing since then, and what was in the field when we had to stop field work, was the migrant tracking. We were trying to track some of these migrants and interview them in person. So that's the piece that's going to now shift to being on phone for us. So given that, let me tell you what we're going to do moving forward as we shift to phone. So we're going to increase the frequency of back checks and high frequency checks. So let me give you 3 specific changes we've made. We're doing 100% back checks. We saved money by going from in-person surveys to phone surveys, because you kind of kick out transport costs, and the surveys are much shorter, so you get them done faster. And so we can afford to do 100% back checks and just keep paying the full team. We added a couple more questions to the end line on things that don't change over time, so you can do consistency checks with the baseline. So you can say, oh, I collected education of the spouse and household head in the baseline. Let me check those are close to the same in the end line. And then we can match, we have phone call logs from the phone calls, and so we can match the call length to the length from the survey CTO instrument. And so you can check that the enumerator was on the call for as long as the survey CTO was being filled. Survey CTO also has audio audits. They tape the enumerator side of the survey. You could use those. I think you'll need IRB for it. There is a standard line we can add to IRBs for it. Luckily, we had added that line even before, so for our previous phone surveys, and so we actually have the ability to do that. Okay, we've also added that our field manager now spends at least half their time looking through the data every day. And then, as I said, once they've looked through the data gets uploaded, and then my data RA in the US will look at the data every day. The SFOs are gonna call each FO daily, go through their tracking sheet together, and go through questions. We've set up a WhatsApp group for all the staff working on the phone surveys, including the RA. And then the RM or the RA writes an email twice a week just to document, are we meeting our targets? Are we following protocols? Were there any other issues that came up? We usually do this with the teams in person. And so what you're doing is transferring a bunch of stuff that you did in person to email or virtually in some way. So both 4 and 6 are mostly now not in person. Okay, so that's kind of the additional monitoring we've set up to shift to these phone surveys where the enumerators are calling from home. Let me talk about the other piece that's maybe the hardest piece of this, which is how do you shorten your survey? So this is kind of a tricky thing to do. Here's some advice, and I'm happy to talk and take more questions about this piece. So I would list a set of maximum 10 outcomes that you care the most about. If you have a pre-analysis plan, this might be easier. If you don't, be brutal. A max of 10 outcomes that you really, really, really care about measuring. And then take each of those outcomes and trace them back to what you need to measure to compute it. So for example, if I care about poverty rates or consumption, that's the outcome. Each item in the consumption module or each question about an expenditure is going to be an input, okay? So take your 10 top outcomes, then figure out what are the inputs that you need for them, and then match those inputs back to the questions in the original end line that you were collecting, the in-person end line. So that's the first step. So you'll have dropped a bunch of stuff that are not in your top 10 already. Okay, that's why I'm saying be brutal and maximum 10 outcomes. The smaller you can make that set of outcomes, the better. If you think you can do 5, do 5. And so the idea is the first cut from this long in-person end line comes from do any of the questions provide an input into your top 10 outcomes? Okay, if they don't, out, just drop it. And then now you have a subset of questions that track to your top 10 outcomes. In all likelihood, this is going to still be too long for you to do on a phone. Remember, I was saying 30 to 40 minutes is kind of the max length you could do. So the next piece is about what do you do next? So you aggregate. This is going to be it's going to be a noisier version of data than is in person because you're aggregating. And that's just kind of the reality we have to face. So let me give you 2 examples from our UBI aggregation process. We had a full consumption module in the in-person end line. It was about 96 questions or cells. Right? Now, some people would say, I would ask you, do you consume rice? If you say no, I'm not going to ask all the rice questions. So it's not that everybody got asked 961 questions. It's just there's 961 cells. We collected data on 275 different items in the consumption module. Okay, so that's the in-person end line. In the phone end line, we ended up with 8 aggregated questions. So we aggregated food consumption to 2 questions. We aggregated all of rent and utilities into 1 question. We aggregated all of personal care items, education into 2 questions, health into 1 question, and durables into 1 question. Okay, now what happens is the reason you also need to aggregate is when you start to aggregate, you also have to describe what you mean by that aggregated question. Food is easier, but personal care is not. So then we have a list of, this includes all these things. It might be long, so try to shorten that, but you kind of have to also provide a bit more explanation when you aggregate. So that's our aggregated consumption module. A second example is an agriculture module. So in our in-person end line, we had plot level modules, crop level modules, detailed labor modules for by activity, by season. And we also had, and we did this, a detailed separate module on livestock, which had separately livestock inputs, livestock stocks of them, livestock outputs like eggs and other things, and then also labor used on livestock separately. So quite detailed ag modules. In the phone end line, we're down to 22 questions. By the way, I didn't try and count up how many cells were in our agriculture module in person because it would have taken a while, so it's really big. The phone end line has 22 questions, and we ask the value of total harvest, the value of total sales, the value of total inputs, a couple of measures of labor by individual. I'll tell you why we did labor by individual in a second, and then assets, and we asked those questions all separately for ag and livestock. So we still separate sort of crops and livestock, and we do all these questions separately for each, but our total number of questions is 22. We decided to do labor by person because one of our big outcomes in UBI is time use and labor supply. And so on our list of 10 is time use and labor supply by individual because the UBI is going to every person. And so we decided to preserve labor by person for our purposes, because we needed individual level data on labor supply. And some of it was coming out of our ag module. And so again, think about aggregating, but make sure you're preserving your top 10 outcomes, right? We have a couple of outcomes that are by individual, but a bunch by household. And so make sure you're preserving all of those. This can take a couple of weeks to do this aggregation. It takes a bit of care, a bit of thought, a bit of, if you've got collaborators working with them, talking it through them. We're happy to share all of our aggregations. So these are two big examples. Happy to give survey instrument, survey CTO, et cetera, for people who need it. Okay, great. I think I'm almost done, so happy to transition to Q&A soon. Let me just say a huge thank you to our UBI team. We've had an immense exercise all of last year, and then this big switch all of this year. So a big thanks to Tessie Lescano, who's on the call, who's my research manager, Deborah, Eunice, Catherine, Mansa, and Shreya. Mansa and Shreya are also on the call. Please feel free to contact any of them or me if you want to talk through exactly what you're thinking of doing and how. And then the last item, I'll figure out how to do this with Sarah, but we're happy to share all our protocols. I think our standard phone survey protocol, which we were using last year, has been posted on the blog already. We're happy to share surveys, both original surveys as well as aggregated surveys, survey CTO code, and anything else we can help with. Great, so let me try and take some questions. Mansa, Shreya, Tessie, if I leave things out, please jump in, and please feel free to take on questions. Okay, so I'm going to just start at the top. Is that how I do this, Sarah?
Yes.
Okay, great.
Feel free to scroll through and answer those that you think are relevant to your audience. We have a lot of questions, so we may not have time to get to them all, but we will post a recording of this and try to get to as many as possible.
Great, that sounds great, and happy to do others by email or reach out to the people. So the first question is from Isabel, who says, if you recruit new enumerators, how will you go about training them to administer the phone survey from their homes? So let me ask Tessie to jump in there. Tessie?
Hi, Tavneed. I can't see the question, but can you just repeat it for me?
Yeah, sure. How do we train new enumerators on the phone survey from their homes?
So I think that's a really good question. We are all trying to kind of brainstorm the best way to do this. One way is using Zoom, as we're doing right now. Another way will be using Skype. It really depends on the magnitude of your team. But I think, if we have a team of like 20 FOs, we would do it through Zoom, make it as interactive as possible, and run through the protocol and the survey itself on the call. And then, of course, be ready to have additional conversations with each of them as needed. Of course, there will be other additions we will make to the protocol itself, on how to, keep the respondent interested, but also how the differences that how we will monitor the field officers from being in their home. But elsewhere, we will do it virtually.
Great. Okay, I'm going to pick up another question from Sophie on sampling when adapting a household survey to a phone survey if you don't have phone numbers. Sophie, good question. I think that's going to be really hard. The only recommendation I have for sampling if you don't have phone numbers is, well, it depends. If you're trying to follow up on an existing sample, that's going to be really hard. If you're trying to create a new sample, you can do random digit dialing. Happy to send you a link for that, Sophie, if you email me, but there's a way to do random digit dialing. So you kind of dial a random set of digits, and you can create a program to generate those. Of course, not all those phone numbers exist, so you kind of have to be careful, but I think that's the only way to start from true scratch. If you don't have numbers and you already have a sample, I would guess trying to call other people who are in the same village and ask them if they have phone numbers for those people. or a village elder, if you have a phone number for a village elder or a village chief, and calling them and asking them if they have the phone numbers would be the best way. Okay, Bobby asks, what validation experimental design work have you done to explore the impact of data collection on answers? So there's a couple of papers, Bobby, that are in the blog from JPAL that do test phone versus face-to-face, and they actually don't find huge differences. So I'm going to send you to that blog. I'm going to take Uzeb, who says, are you worried that phone ownership might be correlated with wealth? Oh, that question just disappeared. Oh, there it is. Sorry, are you worried that phone ownership might be correlated with wealth, social capital, etc.? So the study sample might be different from those who don't have phones. That's certainly true. Uzeb, we work in Kenya where almost everybody has phones. And actually in the UBI study, as part of the design, our survey sample was given phones because we were worried they would migrate and we would need to track them. So in our sample, everybody has a phone because we gave it to them. And so we're okay on that. That is true. You kind of have to decide how big a sample am I getting, how bad, you know, if it's 20% of the whole sample, it might not be worth doing a phone survey. If it's 80%, it is. And then you can try and think about, you know, at the end, kind of thinking about how to deal with attrition with weights. Zeb, if you send me an email, I can send you some links to some papers that create weights for attrition that deal with some of these issues. So I think you could do that. But, you know, if it's really a really small sample that has phones, then it might not be worth doing. Noor, did you try phone surveys with children? No, we did not. And I don't really know how those would go. I'm going to try Javier. Hold on one second. I need to scroll through these questions. Javier, in our face-to-face design, we show a long list of public entities to select from. Wow. Okay, so I guess my answer to this, so Javier says they show a long list of public entities to select from. There's more than 100 on the list. How do we adapt for a phone survey? Javier, I would try to maybe group the public entities by some characteristic, and then create sublists, and then you can pull those on Survey CTO and say, is the public entity, I don't know, a school, a clinic, something like that. And then under that list, there's a smaller sample, and then you can kind of go through them. That's, I think, the best way to do it. So hopefully there's good groupings of these public entities you can use. Orlando, do we use incentives? Yes, we do. We pay, depending on the sample, if it's urban, we were paying about $3 equivalent in airtime. If it's rural, we were using about $1.50. And they work pretty well. You know, in a previous phone survey I did about 1.5 years ago, we played around with the incentive and changed it, and it didn't do that much. So we kind of try to think what's, you know, opportunity cost of time plus a bit of money to recharge your phone. That's kind of how we think of the incentive. Would you be able, Javier, would you be able to share tracking sheets? Yes, I think we can do that. Not filled in ones, of course, Javier. But yes, IRB happy ones. Roshni has a great question. Any tricks and tips to keep respondents engaged during a phone survey? Tessie, I'm going to call on you for this one.
Okay, hi Roshni. So there's not a protocol per se on how to keep respondents engaged, but there are a few things you can definitely do. One of them is, you know, as Tavneet already mentioned, keep the survey as short as possible, 30 to 40 minutes max. Ensure you tell the respondent when you are commencing the survey how long it will take, and, you know, give them time to let you know if they're busy and they're going to be, for example, when we interview businesses, you know, if 30 minutes they expect a customer, do give them the option to like reschedule the survey. Ensure you convey to each participant the importance of their participation. That's really important. And, you know, the benefits of participating, not only the incentive that they will receive, but also, you know, you know, what they will, the greater good of what they're doing. You know, you can say things like, you have been randomly selected to represent the views of Kenyans. That's in our case. You know, and what you say will inform, you know, our research that will then inform policymakers. You know, I think, you know, you can't stress people's, the importance of their participation enough. That really does help. And then ultimately it's just training the field officers to be very, kind and respectful and inquisitive, and just make them available to answer to any question. I think something else that Tavneed mentioned in her presentation, which we have found to be very successful, is when respondents are wary of participating in a survey. It could be they don't trust the organization, they have not heard of it, or they just don't want to do a 40-minute survey. Do tell them that you're going to pass the phone to a supervisor. You know, this has worked super well for us, and that supervisor doesn't necessarily have to be a supervisor. If the supervisor is not available, it could be a fellow FO, and they should be ready to kind of, again, go through everything we've already discussed, you know, why it's important, what they will get in exchange of doing the survey, etc.
Great, thanks, Tessie. Okay, let me pick up a few more questions. Beatrice says, would you consider re-interviewing respondents that already got the in-person end line with the shortened phone survey to see how good a predictor the shortened survey is? Beatrice has two issues here. One is you need the funds to do that. The second is they're not at the same time. So, you know, some of our questions are about what was your profit in the last month? That's obviously not going to necessarily be the same. But if you have the ability to do it and you can do it pretty close back to back, then sure, why not? Melanie asks, how do you deal with ethics for existing projects? Do you request ethics approvals for new projects? So Melanie, I think you should do the IRBs for phone surveys if you haven't done phone surveys. And there's two reasons for this. One is if you had a written consent process in your in-person phone survey, you need to switch that to a verbal consent. We always do verbal consent even in person surveys because people don't like signing things. But you do have to get written, you know, you have to show the IRB or verbal consent. I would check with your IRB office. I know the MIT IRB is doing a bunch of quick turnarounds on this sort of stuff because they realize we need to adapt. And so I've seen a bunch of, and MIT is not the only one, a bunch of universities have set up quick emergency, you know, quick turnaround IRB protocols for this. So I do think you need to do that. You also probably have to give them a copy of the shortened survey because it's a different instrument. So you kind of want to make sure you check all those boxes. Okay. Someone asked, how do you deliver incentives on the phone? Sorry, that question just disappeared, so I can't see who it was. Eitan, we use airtime, prepaid phone credit. You can just send it digitally to the respondent afterwards. So in most, at least in a bunch of countries we work in, that's pretty easy to do. Okay, let me try and scroll back up and say, Martha says, how would you best handle sensitive modules about finance via the phone survey? You know, Martha, we've done a bunch of phone surveys in the past. I personally work on mobile money and digital credit, and we did a mobile money phone survey last year. The year before, we did a digital credit phone survey. They've actually turned out fine. Most people are happy to talk about this, partly because we try to do a bunch of intro around who we are and why we're doing this. And so that doesn't seem to be super hard for us. You know, we do, you know, if people don't want to answer something, we are, you know, we abide by IRBs and make sure we're not really pushing them to answer anything. But in general, I've done credit, savings, all this stuff by phone, and it's been okay. I think training the enumerators is really important to be sensitive to these questions and to be sensitive that if people feel uncomfortable, they know how to handle that. You know, one thing we did say is, I sort of mentioned in the slides, was to make, you know, to try to hand to a supervisor if you think people are feeling uncomfortable, just so they can give them some comfort around why we're doing this.
Yeah, Tavni, just to add on that, I think
Yes.
another technique you can ask when asking participants about sensitive financial information is do inquire with the participants if they want, if they're surrounded by other people, ask them if they can call back in 15 minutes when they can find a place to be alone. This is especially useful if you're like interviewing people that are working in markets or even in households that maybe the spouse doesn't want to share this information with. So just ensure that you're giving the participants as much room to decide how to answer and when to answer these questions.
Thanks, Tessie. Okay, so Karen asks, do you worry more than usual about attrition correlated with treatment status? Karen, yes. So one thing that most of our enumerators actually don't know treatment status, but the data RA in the US does. So we actually check it all the time and try to keep monitoring it and tracking it. This is why it's really important to have a protocol, and the protocol is the same by treatment control. You don't want to change that. So you have to make sure that the protocol is consistently followed for everybody. If you do get low response rates on average, we said try 9 times, you could decide, I think we did this for one survey, we decided to make it 12, but it was across the entire sample that you were trying 12 times. So I think we're very careful at monitoring it. I think we've been lucky, I think to date, not to have attrition based on treatment. That's of course not necessarily a theorem or a truth, but I think it's always a worry even in person. Jose asks, I was wondering if the aggregation made it harder for respondents to recall the expenditures and the need to list examples. Does aggregating save that much time? It does save a chunk of time, Jose. You can decide kind of what level to aggregate at. So again, when we go back to our outcomes, we needed time use, we needed a bunch of other things, assets, wealth, well, not assets, wealth, which assets is one. And so I think you can decide that consumption doesn't have to be 8 questions like we decided, it can be 15. I think, or you can try and ask what you think from baseline are the biggest ticket items that cover, 80% of consumption, and then aggregate the rest. The problem with doing that, we thought a lot about doing that. Let me take, the big 8 items from baseline and say, let me ask these 8 and then aggregate everything else. It's very hard for people to subtract. I think they have some good sense of what they spend on food in the last 7 days. And so it's, if we wanted, like in Kenya, the main staple is maize. I could have said, what did you spend on maize? And then on the rest of your food, that works less well than total food because they have a good sense of approximate numbers for total food. But when you ask them to do total food minus the maize piece, they might go, oh, I can't do it. So I think we found that some of the aggregations we tried to do made sense. Education and health are kind of easier. So, some of this is a bit of a gut feel, Jose. I don't have a great answer to that, but I think thinking about how people think of their expenditures is useful. The other thing in a consumption module is, you ask some things at a daily frequency, some things at a monthly frequency, and some things at an annual frequency. You don't want the aggregation to cross those. So we made sure that, when we aggregated it, it was within the questions for the 7 days, within the questions for the month, right? And so you also have to be careful to manage that across your survey. Maggie asks, how do we handle questions that needed you to observe and not ask verbally? Well, I think either you ask a version of it verbally, like one of the ones we ask observationally is what's the house made of? You'll just have to ask verbally, and again, it will be slightly noisy. If it's something else, then I think it probably has to go. Bernardo asks, since the results are more noisy due to the aggregation, is it feasible to increase the sample size by an important factor to get better results? It's not clear because attrition bias could go many different ways, Bernardo. For us, we're doing a follow-up survey and we already have a baseline, and so we can't add sample in any way. If you had somehow phone numbers and a sample to add, maybe. But we can't do that. We don't have phone numbers for other people. We have no way of truly adding sample. If you're just doing a cross-sectional survey, then yeah, you should try and do as big a sample as you can, I guess, on a budget. Let me just go back up. Carmini asks, what is the productivity on average per surveyor daily for a 30-minute survey? Tessie, that one's yours.
Yes. Hi, Carmini. So the productivity largely is dependent on two main factors. One is how easy the participants are to reach, and the second is how good your FOs are and how acquainted they are with making phone calls. The second, they do get better with time. But I think in previous surveys we've done that are 30 to 40 minutes, we can do 7 per day. But again, it does depend on these two factors I mentioned previously.
Okay, let me go back to questions. Oh, wow. Okay, so Katya asks, in terms of cost savings, can you give a ballpark estimate of how much in percent the budget shrinks by moving to a phone survey in your Kenyan context? Tessie, I think that one's yours too.
So that's a really difficult question to answer. It depends on so many things. Yes, transport is, at least in IPA Kenya, it is one of our biggest costs. But again, if you're not paying DSA and you're only paying transport, and you're only paying transport from, let's say, Nairobi to the outskirts of Nairobi, the change is not going to be that substantial. I mean, you'll be paying less in rent because the field officers will be working from home, but you'll need to be spending more on airtime. So it really varies from budget to budget and situation.
Thanks, Tessie. Okay. Bilal asks, how is 100% audio recording as a quality assessment method? Obviously, after seeking respondent concurrence. So 2 things on this, Bilal. Sub-ACTO doesn't record the whole call. It only records the enumerator side of the call, as I understand it. So it doesn't have the respondent's answers. The second, so you could, I guess, if you're working on smartphones and things, you can actually, I guess, record the call. It makes me a little uncomfortable recording everybody's calls for many reasons. I worry that the respondents won't be okay with this, number one. Number two, someone has to go through those and listen to them and see if they're okay in some ways. And so I think that's another hard job, and you need staff to do that. And then IRB. This has to go through IRB if you're recording the calls. There's a separate hurdle for recording calls in IRB. And so I would recommend you clear it with your IRB too. Tanya asks for recommendations where surveyors are making calls from home. Yes, there was sort of 6 or 7 different things that I suggested on making calls from home during COVID. During COVID, all the calls should be made from home by the enumerators. And so the big thing is I'll post the slides, or Sarah will post the slides. There's about 6 or 7 tips for how to do more monitoring of the surveyors, how to do more high frequency checks, and what they are. Mock asks, does success with aggregation indicate we should rethink using the long form of these cumbersome surveys in future surveys? I think. Good question, Mock, for the future. My mind is kind of at the point of trying to help us adapt to this. Yeah, if they work well, I think maybe it's time to revisit some of these. I'd like to understand what work well means, and we haven't really done a great job, at least in household surveys, of aggregation versus non-aggregating. We've done some of these in in firm surveys. So there it actually, instead of going through all the profits, revenues, and costs components, asking profits, revenues, and costs seems to work pretty well, actually. So there, I think we do use aggregation quite a lot. And in our UBI enterprise survey, where we covered several thousand businesses at the end of last year, we used a lot of aggregation. So yeah, let's talk about it after this is past us. Okay. Let me take this question from Atma. I think I have that right. Would you have any tips for hiring enumerators? What would you recommend that I look out for in an enumerator, given I would hire them or interview them over a call? Tessie, this one's yours.
Hi, Atma. So it depends on the study and what you would need those field officers to be aware of. For example, you know, if you're doing a health study, and it's about fertility, you might want to have only female field officers that have some kind of experience with health. But normally, you know, we ask the field officers in IPA Kenya conduct like 2 rounds of interviews. One is written, where we ask them some basic questions on research, on topics, and then the next round it's more one-on-one, where we really go in depth into how they would answer certain questions, and you know, maybe do a test with them on how they would conduct a phone survey and see how friendly and how willing they are to answer very difficult questions.
Great, thanks, Tessie. Okay, question from Shayna. How do you efficiently handle multiple languages with random digit dial surveys where you don't know which of the many languages enumerators will encounter? Right, so this is a great question, Shayna. I think, first of all, you want enumerators who at least can recognize a language. And so I would this is probably what I would do. I'll ask Tessie if she has any other comments, but I'd probably record on the tracking sheet and then try to reassign it to another FO, and also do that in Survey CTO if you're using Survey CTO. So I think you'd have to reassign it to an FO that knows that language. So when we're working in the office, it's really easy to do because you can just hand the phone to another FO, right, and get them to do it. Here, and this is true as you move to phone surveys conducted by enumerators in their homes, there is going to be a reassignment by language. Because we're doing an end line, so we know what the languages are, we can do that better, right? But if this is a first-time survey, then you'll have to have a reassignment process. And I would probably do both on the tracking sheet and on Survey CTO. Okay, great. So Srijana, I hope I got your name right. I'm sorry if I butchered it. How do you capture phone logs to compare with survey time reported to Survey CTO? Good, Mansa's gonna answer that one for you.
Hi, Srijana. So our enumerators actually have phones which are IPA owned, and the field manager and the RAs actually have access to the call logs that are made from those phones. And those are the phones which the enumerators are essentially supposed to be using when they're calling our respondents. And so from on the management end, we do have access to the call logs which the enumerators for the phone numbers that the enumerators are using to make the call, and then the call duration, the survey duration, which you can actually see in Survey CTO if you add the start time and the end time fields in your Survey CTO form. And this might be tedious to sort of compare what the call duration according to the call logs is versus what the survey duration is, but considering that the setup that we're working in, we can't really monitor FOs in person, this is just one of the ways we can actually sort of monitor whether they're not leaving surveys on their tablets, or whether they're actually making the call. And I think the call logs, another point that was there in Tivneet's slide, is that call logs also have at what time were the calls made. And I think, again, given the setup that we're in, we cannot really monitor when the surveyors, when they start work, when they end up work, when they're making the last call, etc., because we can obviously do that in person. So I guess like call logs are also like, at least initially, we can use them to monitor like whether they're actually sort of working in the framework we'd like in the work as we'd like them to work in, even if they're at home. Yeah.
Thanks, Manta. Okay, Luke has a great question. I'm not sure I have a great answer for you, Luke, but let's try. Any suggestions for how to transition qual work to a phone survey? It's understanding that probing is more difficult. So this is a great question, Luke. I'm not sure I have a great answer for you. I can try and suggest a couple of ideas. I think if you're trying to do qual work, building a rapport and trust with the respondent is going to be super, super, super important. Because you're right, probing will be more difficult and you can't see a face and it's hard from a voice response to do this. I don't know where you're working. I guess you could do you know, a Skype call or a Zoom call or something if there's internet and stuff like that. Most of our respondents would not have smartphones, so that's impossible. We have to do voice calls. So I would say spend more time on the front end, sort of laying the grounds for what you're doing, why you're doing it, why it's important, what it does, what you learn from it, you know, kind of things like that. And so I think that piece is going to be super, super important. In general, I think that's important, even for quantitative phone surveys, is building a bit of trust and a rapport with the respondent is really important. So my sense is that's really important, number one. Number two, I think if you're doing it yourself versus having some field staff do it for you, having sort of a sense of how questions should progress will provide value. What are all the possible ways this probe could go? And can I figure out what way it's going? Especially if you're halfway through. So imagine that you were doing in-person sort of qual surveys already. Look at that data and kind of figure out, okay, can I see if someone says X, Y, Z, this is where they're headed or not? I don't know if you can see that in the existing data, but I'd be looking at what I have already really carefully, trying to understand, okay, what sorts of probing seems to be working and what sorts of probing takes you down trains or sort of start off trains that are useful. Tessie, anything else?
No, I think you covered it.
Great, thank you. Natasha asks, could you elaborate on what the follow-up on refusals entails? Is this primarily to understand why they refused the call? Tessie, you want to take that one?
Sure. Hi, Natasha. So I think, as you probably know, even from your personal experience, you sometimes get people phoning you and saying, can we make a quick survey? And the first thing we always say is like, no, sorry, I'm really busy. This is the same. So basically, we just want to ensure that the field officers on the first try did explain the study, did go through what it would entail, to make sure that it is in fact a real refusal for the study rather than they just didn't have time. And honestly, it has proven really successful. We had in the UBI, we actually turned 20 refusals out of 30 odd simply by doing this exercise and having a field manager phoning them and explaining the study.
Great, thanks, Tessie. Jennifer asks, have you experienced any sluggish infrastructure or in-country breakdown of cell phone reach in different countries you work in? Do you anticipate this as the world shifts to this model? Great question, Jennifer. We haven't yet. We do have a lot of cell phones that are off, Jennifer, because actually a lot of people don't keep them on all the time because it costs to keep them on. So we do, that's why we're doing so many callbacks, is because phones are off. So one thing is, if you're feeling like there's lots of phones that are off, you can change the 9 times a day to 12 times or something. Sorry, not 9 times a day, 9 times total, 3 times a day, 3 days that is separated by a day. You could add another set of a day with 3 times over that to try and deal with that. Sometimes we have, after, we did this, I think last year was after the 9, if we felt like the response rate wasn't great, we set up another 3, but you can stretch, you can say, okay, let's do those weekends or evenings when we think people's phones will be on better, or when we think maybe the load on the network is lower. I think weekends, the load might be higher, so that's not great for that, but kind of thinking about when you think people's phones might be on and when the load on the network would be lower. Okay, I've got a question from Zion. Considering the current situation, COVID-19, how to manage health-related questions, any tips? That's a great question. I think I don't have a great answer. I can give you a couple of examples. We did, when we do anthropometrics in the field, we do have to tell people if their kids are very, very low BMI. So we do give that feedback explicitly when we're collecting anthropometrics, and we tell them to sort of go to the nearest clinic or talk to a clinician or a village sort of health person. I think I would probably do the same here. I do think if they ask you about COVID, maybe just talking about social distancing would be good, I think, in general. But I would not want to give a ton of health advice since I'm not a health practitioner. But I think it's a great question. You might want to know for people, where's the closest clinic, where can they go? Kind of a set of resources of where to go for more, I think would be useful. Anything to add, Tessie?
Nothing, yeah, you said it.
Okay, Naria asks, any tips for asking questions related to travel? Should we just not ask about it since it's going to be abnormal during COVID? Naria, good question. I think we are going to try and do a separate survey around COVID if we can. And there we will ask about questions related to travel, but because we want to see if they're abnormal. So I think, yes, if you want to compare them to the rest of your sample, don't do that, or be aware if you collected it that it won't be normal because of that. But it might be one of the questions to drop as you go from in-person to phone. Again, if it's not one of your top 10 outcomes, it should be dropped anyways. Bobby asks, have you had to provide phones to people to make this feasible? We have given phones to the enumerators. Those are IPA phones for sure. We had given out phones as part of our study originally because we did want to track people. We expected the UBI might affect migration, and so we really wanted to make sure we could track everybody. And so both our survey sample and our enumerators have phones from us. The enumerators, of course, will give them back to us. The survey sample can keep them. Okay, Alex asked, do you provide a different phone number for respondents to call back? I think it can be confusing to enumerators if respondents keep calling back through the same numbers. I'm not sure exactly what you mean, Alex. In the consent, we do have, if you have concerns, you can reach this number or reach these people. But that's the only place we provide respondents any information about contact. Now, of course, on their phone, they have the phone number they got called from, which is technically an IPA phone. But, that's what we use. If you mean, I call a respondent and they don't answer and they see the phone come again, do I switch up the phone numbers? Tessie, do we do that? I don't think so. We won't during COVID, of course, because people are calling from in-home.
Yeah,
so during this time, we won't.
Exactly. We try to minimize this, although sometimes it's hard, right? So we give a field officer their tracking sheet, but of course, say for example that field officer goes on leave, then of course we will then give it off to another field officer. But I'm confused also if you mean like if we provide phone numbers to respondents, as Tavneet says, we do definitely. It's fundamental that we provide at least more than one, and that we ensure that these phone numbers are available and will be turned on even after the study ends, because it will surprise you that they call sometimes 6 months afterwards, and you always have to be willing to answer.
I think we're almost out of time. So should I hand back to you, Sarah?
Yeah. Thank you very much, Tessie and Mansa. Thanks everyone for joining. I think we get any questions as possible, and probably most of them, you can go check out our blog post, which answers questions that we either dismissed or that are still on here. I've put the link on the screen that I'm sharing right now. And we are also going to put the recording of this webinar on the website so you can refer to it. So thank you very much. This was very helpful. And
Sarah, can I say one thing? I just wanted to wish everybody good luck with this. And if you have questions, please reach out to our team and we'll try and help as much as we can.
have neat. And stay, wash your hands, stay healthy.
Absolutely.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Bye.